Evening all, and welcome to this meeting of the Governance and Audit Committee of Colchester City Council on Tuesday the 5th of March 2024. My name's Chris Pearson. I'm Councillor for Beerchurch and chair this committee. In the event of an emergency, and I'm not expecting any practice alarms this evening, please evacuate the town hall by going down the main staircase or the back staircase to the car park behind the town hall in Runwell Street. Meeting is being held in the grand jury room at the town hall and is being broadcast live over the internet, where it can be watched via the council's YouTube channel and will be recorded for viewing at any time in the future. Members of the committee are reminded that they can use electronic devices but should set them to silent and speak directly into the microphone when given the opportunity to do so. There are toilets on every floor in the building and an induction loop in the room. If we are going past 8 o'clock, we will have a short break. And I'll just remind all members that the Constitution requires meetings to conclude by 10 p.m. I'll now do introductions for the rest of the committee and those who are present by asking Councillor Smith on my left to begin.
Good evening, Councillor Paul Smith, St Anne's and St John's Ward.
Good evening, I'm Richard Carr and I'm Interim Managing Director for Colchester Commercial Holdings, which owns the subsidiaries referred to in the report later.
Good evening, Councillor Paul Dundas, Tiptree Ward.
Councillor Alison J, Highwards Ward. Good evening, Councillor Sarah Naylor, Lexton and Braidwood Ward.
Councillor William Sunnox, Rural North Ward, and the Conservative Opposition Finance Spokesman.
Councillor Dave Harris, Beerchurch Ward. Good evening, Chair. Thank you.
Sorry, Chris Hartgrove, Deputy Section 151 Officer.
Matthew Evans, Democratic Services Officer.
Thank you, everyone. I'm not aware of any substitutions this evening. All the members of the committee are present, which is good news. I'm not aware of any urgent items. However, I have just had a quick chat with Mr. Evans about the possibility of arranging a further meeting should we decide that's appropriate as we go through this evening. We'll take that as we need to over the course of the evening. Any declarations of interest? Item 4. Councillor Smith.
For information, I am the portfolio holder responsible for housing. It has been cleared by the monitoring officer, so I do not have a conflict of interest on this matter.
Thank you. And I've been advised accordingly as well, so there are no issues with Councillor Smith attending and participating in every item that's on the agenda this evening. Item 5, minutes of the previous meeting. Are there any items in those minutes that anyone, or minutes of the, 12th of September, are there any matters in those minutes that anyone wishes to raise? No. Can we take those as an accurate record then, please? Yep, that's agreed. Thank you. Have your say. I am aware that Councillor Warnes has indicated a wish to comment on the report from Colchester Borough Homes, but other than that, I'm not aware of any have your say indications for this evening. No. Thank you. So that takes us on to item 7, hibernation of Colchester Amphora Homes Limited, and I'm going to pass over to Richard Carr to introduce this, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Chair, and hopefully This is a process that the committee are familiar with because it's the same process that we went through to formalise the hibernation of Kale, the energy company that also is part of the Amphora group. This specific set of proposals relates to the proposed hibernation of Colchester Amphora Homes, which is entirely in line with the strategy that you considered towards the end of last year and was subsequently adopted by the Cabinet. So we've gone through a due diligence process looking at the one asset and also the third-party agreements that Colchester Amphora Homes has. And what you'll see contained within the paperwork is how each of those issues is proposed to be treated. And what that means is that I think we are in a position where the committee, on behalf of the council as the overseer of the shareholder interest in the companies, can actually consider the formal resolutions that are set out in Appendix 3 with a view to then proposing those to the Cabinet for consideration. And I should make clear that the requisite resolutions that are required of Colchester Amphora Homes Limited Board and subsequently Colchester Commercial Holdings Limited Board have all been formally approved, hence we can come forward with these recommendations. So I think if I stop there, Chair, and then I'll respond to any questions that emerge from the discussion.
Thank you. And I was certainly keen to ensure that the appropriate board decisions have been taken before this was brought to us this evening. Questions or comments? Councillor Dundas.
It's live, sorry, the microphone had gone off. Thank you for that. I've just got a few questions, probably primarily around the risks regarding the HIF grant, grant is probably the right word for it. I mean, I think it's for 560 homes, if I remember rightly, somewhere in the report. I haven't got the right page quite in front of me. We know that there was planning permission for 360 at Mill Road. Presumably we are putting 200 else, or anticipated 200 from elsewhere, maybe Military Road or other sites in there. What is the current status of that grant? Has there been a variation on it? And under the current standing of it between us and Homes England, where are we saying we're going to build these houses? Presumably, if we've moved some off, we're not putting them all on Mill Road. We've said they're going various different places. That's my first question. Secondly, and I have to be careful because I've got the current managing director sitting next to me. But once this is hibernated, with the energy company also have gone, we're left with the events company. We're left with Helpline. There is some sort of residual work going on with the fibre, but I'm not actually sure that that's particularly significant at the moment. I might be wrong. Presumably the events company currently has its own management team, and actually from what I hear is doing reasonably well, as does Helpline. We're recruiting for a new managing director for CCHL, but there's a lot less of CCHL than the current role. So my question is, why do we need one? If we've got two operational companies, events and Helpline, which seem to be doing fine, why do we need to bring somebody else in at significant cost? Would be my first two questions. Thank you.
Richard, I don't know whether you're the appropriate person to answer either of those questions, but I'll throw it open to you to begin with, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, well, I'll make a start. And there's obviously a limit to how far I can comment on those two issues, but I'll do my best. So, first of all, in terms of the HIF grant, my understanding is that is primarily linked to the development of the Northern Gateway site. And that is a agreement that exists between the City Council and Homes England. So in that sense, the reason I haven't said more about it as part of the proposed hibernation is because the issues about securing the grant are not germane to the hibernation proposal. My understanding, though, is that the City Council have had quite in-depth discussions with Homes England about the current status of the Northern Gateway site, and I think there is a reasonable expectation that Homes England will be accommodating of the current position. So I think, in summary, the risks of that grant being lost to the council are contained. I think that's what I would say at the moment. In terms of your points about what is left of the Amphora group once we, assuming you do, agree to the hibernation of the second of these subsidiaries. So first of all, just to kind of expand on one area that you touched on, we're currently completing a review of Colchester Fibre. I think there is significant value in that operation remaining part of Colchester Homes. This is a discussion that will come to a subsequent meeting. But one of the reasons for that is that the council received a sum of grant from government to install that network, a condition of which is to look for opportunities to commercialise that network. And if you were to do other than at this stage, retain the fibre operation within Amphora, there is a likelihood that you would be required to repay grant, and you can only commercialise the network through a local authority trading company. So I think there's a little bit more to what is left in Amphora than perhaps might be first apparent. But nevertheless, it is true that the effect of the strategy that you, as a council, supported towards the end of last year is that the Amphora operation becomes a much simpler operation and a smaller operation. And in recognition of that, you are correct that arrangements are being made to recruit a replacement permanent managing director, but that is on the basis of at least exploring the opportunity for that role to be done on a part-time basis rather than a full-time basis. And there has been an adjustment to things like the proposed remuneration levels to reflect that it is not as complex a business as it has been in the past. So I think there has been an appropriate recognition of the factors that you were alluding to there, I would suggest.
Thank you. I couldn't have put it better myself, but I don't know whether Councillor Corey, you want to comment at all at this stage. Yeah. Councillor Dundas.
Yeah, I think I'm aware that it's. I think I've seen the advert pop up somewhere, and I think it's rather strangely worded. It says 37 hours a week part time. Up to 37. I guess my only other question is going back. Why, when the grant agreement was for 560 residential units in Northern Gateway, why did we then go for planning permission for 360? We must have had a plan where to put the extra 200. Where are they going? And what was the plan?
Good question. I don't know the answer, but Councillor Smith is indicating he may well do.
I think there was going to be the healthcare facility as well, which would provided significant numbers of units for accommodation. And my guess is that they were included within the numbers to bring it up to 580, because that was going to be a substantial area. The retirement area for, yeah. So I think that's the missing ones. Whether that's exactly the total or not, I don't know, but that's a big difference.
And my understanding is that site, the outline planning permission may alter anyway, depending on what the future disposal of the site looks like. So I think we'll have to watch this space. I think you make some very valid points about the size of CCHL going forward, but being mindful of the fact that we have agreed around this table now to not close 2 companies, but to hibernate 2 companies with a potential for opening them up again at some point in the future, should they prove to be viable, indicates that having a holding organisation is the most appropriate thing to do, rather than merging everything into one company with two outliers and no overarching organisational structure. Someone owes the mayor a small fortune. I think it was Councillor Naylor this time. You're let off, Councillor Smith. Councillor Dundas, does that answer your
I think it does. I think the only perhaps comment I would make is that it seems that in terms of the skill set we're looking for around a managing director, it seems to be the fibre is going to be the main challenge. It rather seems to me that the events company and the helpline are running, as far as I can work out, reasonably well as they currently are, but the fibre is probably where we need some extra skills or something more changes. Is that right?
So I certainly think that there needs to be an appropriate focus on the fibre element of it. I would concur with your view that events and the helpline activities, CCTV, all of that at one level looks after itself. But I think the issue is actually looking at the opportunities to go beyond current performance. And so I wouldn't underestimate the fact that you do need someone that's going to look to drive those businesses forward. So, but I think the blend of skills that are needed going forward are different from those that were required in the past. That's undoubtedly the case.
Thank you. And I would agree with you, Richard. I think we need to be mindful of the fact that although elements of CCHL may appear to be operating quite successfully at the moment, in the future we could have turnover of personnel that changes that situation. So I think it's essential that the managing director has sufficient skills in those areas to ensure that there is day-to-day challenge and keeping those parts of the business on track, and as you quite rightly point out, Richard, developing and expanding. Right, I've got Councillor Sunnox and then Councillor Harris. Councillor Sunnox?
Yes, I want to echo Councillor Dundas's questions about the CCHL and go a little bit further. Why we've really got one trading company, and I'm not quite sure where the fibre is. Is that in Homes or is it in CCHL?
It is part of Colchester and Fora Trading Limited.
Right. So we've got one company which has got three businesses in it. It's got the helpline, the fibre, and the event. So why don't we dormant the holding company? Not dissolve it, just dormant it. Take all the activities out of it, and we just have a motionless company there, put all the activity into CATL and simplify everything down. We don't need a corporate type managing director at holding company level. You probably need an accountant to do some very, very brief accounting for it, simplify it down and take the cost right out. That's the direction I'd hope we'd go. So it's the same direction as we're going, but further and faster. And then the next sort of area where we're making a company dormant, we've got to make sure that a CAHL dormant need to be sure that there's proper homes for all its activities. And as I understand it, it's mainly been concerned with the Northern Gateway scheme. So my next question is, where is responsibility for that? And have we got a strategy for dealing with the Mill Road land and so on? What are we going to do with it? I know it's a contentious issue, but I really think we need a strategy for that, not only because of the financial, the money that's going out on interest on the borrowings that it's carrying, which we've made a big point of already, but also because without a strategy, is that grant secure? It seems that we are really, really at risk making company dormant, not having a replacement strategy. That's the moment when someone from Homes England could say, for goodness sake, just pay that money back. I don't know the detail of the grant, but it just seems to be a very risky stage to be going through.
And I hear what you're saying, and I know from the meetings that I've been involved with that there are ongoing moves, plans afoot by the administration to deal with that site, to ensure that that site is at some point in the not too distant future actually built on. How that is built on and what format that will take is very much a decision for the administration. The feedback that Richard Carr has given us this evening and that I've been picking up from those meetings is that it's unlikely, that doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it's unlikely that the HIF grant would be asked back. So although there is a risk, the information that's coming, the advice and guidance that's coming from the council's officers is that that risk is small. So I take your point, William, and I think those are questions perhaps for you to ask of Cabinet rather than here this evening, but I take your point. With regard to CCHL and how it's structured, we've heard from Richard Carr this evening about the direction of travel that's been taken over the last, 15 months or so now, I guess it must be. We've had a number of reports come to governance and audit about the direction of travel. We've more or less rubber stamped the proposals that have been brought to us up until now. And that included retaining the holding company. So I think, you know, you're making a point that's worth consideration, but I think it's a point for the administration to take away and decide whether or not there's any merit in, rather than for us this evening at G&A to make a suggestion to Cabinet that they look again at the structure of Colchester Commercial Holdings Limited. Back to you.
And just coming back on one other point, it says it's too early to determine the cost of hibernating these companies. I find that really worrying. If you make a decision, you want to know the cost in advance. I think the costs are quite clear. There's going to be some write-downs, about 1.2 million, something like that, just mechanical write-downs. Whether there's further write-downs of the assets in the books, I don't know. But just looking at the accounts of the companies, both of them are in deficit. We've not recognised in Colchester's book the accumulated deficits over those, the overhead basically of those companies over the years, and that's going to hit us about 1.2 million. And I would argue that that ought to be, you know, we shouldn't be punting that forward down the road. We ought to look at that now and know where we are.
Richard?
Sorry, just to be clear on that, that's hence my reference to the advice that the council has received from Section 151 officer as part of his Section 25 report to your council meeting. So he has made some provision for that. So I would agree. I think the crystallisation of the financial consequences is really important, and if you agree to the proposals and if Cabinet agree to the proposals tonight, then the focus is on achieving all of that before the year end, because I think it would be really helpful to get that crystallisation for all players in this context.
Do you want to add anything, Chris? No, okay, thank you. Yeah. Andrew, just with regard to that last point, is there anything?
No, I mean, I think it's been acknowledged as a a liability that the council will have to will have to incur. There's a range that we expect it to be within. The work now is to, as you say, crystallise that liability and make sure it's included in the accounts for 23-24.
Thank you, Andrew. And my apologies, I should have invited those of you online to introduce yourselves at the start of the meeting. Anything else, Councillor Sunnucks? No? Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. I found myself thinking, as you said, your last couple of paragraphs, you took the words right out of my mouth. This is for a recommendation to go to the Cabinet as a resolution, isn't it? And the decision we'll be making there, our job here is to consider the options. And for me, the option of keeping the company or closing the company totally down is one that we don't need to take. It's the same process anyway. In case you need to take it at some stage further on and reopen it again, the option is there for you. And it costs the same to close down as it does to actually hibernate. Let's do the hibernation in the hope that something will change in the future that we'll need it again. So I'm sort of formally, totally taking the recommend decision, because it goes to Cabinet, of course, and the decisions will be making there in other places, apart from governance and audit, of course. So that's how I feel about it, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harris. The only thing that's outstanding from my perspective when I looked at this was in page 29 of our papers, 6.3 refers to the shareholder committee, which we are, and the terms of reference not making any mention of the strategic director to whom the shareholder function has been delegated. And I thought that when I read those paragraphs, it was slightly confusing as to whether or not this committee has the responsibility to make decisions as the shareholder and to make recommendations to Cabinet, or a strategic director had that responsibility. So I think I would just like to ask that we ask our monitoring officer to clarify that position going forward. Apart from that, I think we're back to the recommendation at the top of the document to approve the hibernation, or to recommend to Cabinet that we approve the hibernation of CAHL. Agreed? Yep, thank you. And it just leaves me to say thank you very much to Richard Carr for all your contributions to this committee over the last year or so. And I know you've still got a week or two or three with Colchester City Council, but I wish you all the best in your next endeavour, which I'm sure will be much easier than this one.
You're only saying that, Chair, because you know what I'm going to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Yeah, been a pleasure. Thank you.
Right, that takes us on to item 8, review of Colchester Borough Home's performance. And I'm just going to ask the members of CBH, those representing CBH, to come along and take their seats, please, and then we'll do introductions for everyone. Right. So I'm just going to ask you to do introductions. I'll start with Philip first, and then we'll just go along, and then I'm going to bring Councillor Warnes in for his have your say. So Philip, if you could start, please.
Thank you. I'm Philip Sullivan, Chief Executive of Colchester Borough Homes.
Good evening, I'm Esme Cole, Chair of Colchester Borough Homes.
Good evening, I'm Karen Lohman, Director of Operations.
Good evening, I'm Jeff Bills, I'm the Client Services Manager for Colchester City Council.
And Lucy? Lucy Bradman? Lucy there?
Sorry, I do apologise. Lucy Bradman, Strategic Director.
Thank you, Lucy. All right, at this point then, and welcome all of you to Governance and Audit this evening. I'm just going to bring Councillor Warnes in, who has a question and a comment, I think, around something that's in this evening's report. Councillor Warnes, you know the drill.
Good evening, Chair. Good evening, everybody here and those representing Colchester Borough Homes. I'm here to speak on some issues relating to the report relating to Colchester Borough Homes. And as somebody who's worked in housing for a large part of my career, it's good to see that we're finally going back to housing inspections. It's only taken about 20, 30 years, but we've finally come round, and that during that journey, there's been times when tenant participation and satisfaction has been at the top of the tree and times when it's been at the bottom. And we seem to be heading somewhere towards making tenant satisfaction matter once more. And I note in the report that you are advised that in order so you can be confident that the arm's length management company is meeting these statutory regulations that are coming to these performance reports will actually help you do that. What I'd like to say is that it's probably, my advice to you is that I would look beyond the stats and the figures, and whilst they will tell you so much, and maybe benchmarked against this and benchmarked against that, and the top quartile for this and the second quartile for that, my advice is look a bit deeper and look at the processes in the way that some of the issues that affect performance happen. And in that respect, my main issue would be around the void or empty property relet time. Certainly, in the time I worked for this authority in the noughties, it was an issue then, and it's ebbed and flowed since. And I think that whilst we have to recognise that reletting homes is only part of getting people satisfactorily rehoused, because you'll only let so many properties a year. You might have several thousand, but you might only have, 100, 150 that will come up within a year that you can relet. So that's part of the story, but it's an important part, because it's been recognised in a report that 42 days isn't really good enough. And certainly I've been raising for years that we need to be much more ambitious on that, and I would question whether even 28 days is actually ambitious. I think there's a much quicker target that could actually be sort of reached. And my advice to you as members of the shareholder committee is you want to deep dive into that. You want to know more about the processes that go into that. So one of the dangers when you're trying to relet properties is what is called handoff. So there will be a long set of processes that will have to happen in order for when someone hands in their notice or they are evicted towards somebody taking the keys and signing up. And you need to get from A to B, and most logically you would see it as a straight line. How do I get from end of tenancy to start tenancy? But the reality in actually managing empty properties is much more of an actual jagged line. And there will be breaks in that line. And what you need to do is you need to iron those breaks out. And that involves process mapping. And that involves looking at the tasks and seeing where you get to a stage where something has to wait for somebody to actually do something in order for the process to go forward. That is where the delay comes in. And so you want a process where there is collective ownership of that process and people are pulling forward, trying to make sure that all those processes happen in the shortest time possible to be much more efficient in sort of lettings. So that would include things like weekly void meetings involving everybody in the process. So everybody involved in letting empty homes, be they the person that allocates, the person that oversees the repairs that need to be carried out, the person that makes sure all of, you know, the certification is in place. They're all at that meeting, they're all accountable to each other, and they can see what is and isn't being done and what needs to be done in order to make it happen. And I'm really saying that unless you have a deep dive into that, you will just be presented with stats and figures that may or may not look like the job is being done satisfactorily. But I think we could be a lot more ambitious. The other issue I wanted to talk about was about damp and mould. I noticed from, you know, the performance figures that has risen quite substantially. Now, within housing legislation, damp and mould are seen as dangerous hazards, and it would actually prevent a property being re-let. They are called category 1 hazards, and they should not be present when a property is let. So the question is, how do you tackle that? Do you just, you know, how do you tackle that during the life cycle of the property? And therefore, do you only tackle the issues when they appear? Are you actually reactive to them? And you tackle them as and when they appear at an actual letting stage, or are you more actively managing them during the life cycle of the property? And when you do that, that's not just about managing the property, it's also about managing the people in the property. Because although it says damp and mould, one tends to be caused by the way the property is lived in, and one can be caused by more substantial things like coming up through the floor, commonly known as sort of rising damp. So therefore, I would hope it would be a much more proactive one about trying to prevent damp during the life cycle of the property, rather than just dealing with it as and when it has to be done when the property is let. So again, I'm saying to you, as a shareholder committee, look a bit deeper, have a bit deeper interest than just see just what is going on. And the final issue is in your repairs and maintenance service. This council, in line with the 2013 Social Value Act, has social value indicators. And sometimes it's difficult to see those because they're hid often within the equality and diversity section of the agendas you get. Sometimes you'll see a link that says, look here. And when you look into it, you can see there's a whole level of indicators that if I was in your shoes, I'd be wanting to see whether they were being implemented or not. And they might be things like the report talks about recruitment issues. I mean, that's something that's been industry-wide for at least a decade. And when you've got a lot of house building going on, there is demand for those skills. So it can be difficult to actually recruit. But are you offering apprenticeships? Are you offering those in areas where there is social deprivation within the town? Are you offering them to ex-service personnel? Are you offering retraining opportunities? In other words, are you embedding your social values that as a council you have adopted? And are you satisfied for those to be hid within the quality and diversity heading, or do you want to see them more explicit? So those are the things I would advise you as shareholders. Look beyond the figures, take a deeper dive, see what's going on, and I think that could influence the performance information that you are receiving. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Warnes. Just before I bring Philip in to respond to one or two of the queries that you raised there, what I would say is that governance and audit in the last 12 months has taken the view that we need to be much more proactive and detailed in terms of our analysis of what happens at Colchester Borough Homes and what happens at Colchester Commercial Holdings Limited than we have been previously. And hence, we will be getting regular reports coming to this committee from CBH, and quite rightly you point out that we need to be constructive challenges to the reports that come to us. Certainly there's a lot more information in this paper than I've seen come to the Governance and Audit Committee previously, and getting our heads around it may not occur as well as you are suggesting we should this evening with our first look, but I would hope that going forward we will take on board some of the comments, if not all of the comments that you made this evening about how we go about challenging the officers who are responsible for Colchester Borough Homes. Philip, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. All very important points. Briefly on each of them. The first one, in terms of voids, relets, in terms of performance, we'll pick that up as part of the main report, but the principle of deep dives is one I think is absolutely right. It's something that we do deep dives in terms of service areas. That can be an extra element of assurance that we would be happy to bring to a committee on specific topics, relets being one, should the committee request, and we can work with the committee to identify them and bring them through. I think that's a perfectly appropriate and a good suggestion. Thank you. The second one, in terms of damp and mould and whether we proactively pick up on them. We do. The way we do that is through our stock condition surveys. So our stock condition surveys, again, you rightly picked up on category 1 hazards. So under the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, one of those category 1 hazards can be related to damp and mould. So when we're doing our stock condition surveys, we do pick up on them proactively through that. It also is reactive when tenants report through damp and mould cases. Just briefly, I'd say that we're taking that to the next level. So we're looking at property archetypes that have characteristics which lend themselves more to damp and mould. And we're also looking at the people who live in the homes, particularly in respect of vulnerability, so that we can overlay the two and prioritise our resources to tackle that. It's a really important point. And finally, in terms of social value and sort of apprenticeships and similar, so we do get involved in initiatives like that, and we have graduates at the moment. We're also members of the Defence Employee Recognition Scheme. So we guarantee interviews, for example, to anyone from the military who demonstrates they meet the person's specifications. So again, very important points, and we are very positive about contributing to that.
Thank you. Councillor Warnes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. It's really good to know that you're abreast of, some of the issues. The knotty one is the void empty property relay. That does take a specific skill set to be able to pull that forward, and I've often felt that the performance on that has never really been what it should be. I mean, you often hear contractors or those in charge of looking after assets wanting to use an empty property to be able to store various materials whilst they're doing a modernisation programme, and that will cause outliers within the actual process because they might be tied up for sort of some period, and you ought to move towards using a container on site rather than doing that, because these are homes that people could be living on. One of the other things that's happened in the industry over the years is the long years of hollowing out local government finance, which has been going on for at least a decade, is that people like clerk of the works are no longer there. And so there's a danger of relying on consultants to do stock condition surveys, because they will clone. They will look at 2 or 3 down the row and then clone the results for the rest. And you often need, that's where the clerk of the works used to come in. They would go and visibly check those surveys and just iron out a lot of the issues that kind of may exist. They can have quite serious cost implications if they are not actually got right. So once again, thank you for, listening to me tonight. And I hope as someone who's been in the industry for decades, I've been able to add something to it.
Thank you, Councillor Warnes. And we have the advantage this evening of having the portfolio holder as a member of the committee, and he just wanted to add something as well on, with regard to one of the remarks that you made.
Thank you. Yes, first of all, congratulations for highlighting, I think, the key areas where we're seeing in the performance there. Regarding the social value, one of the things that we do with all contracts that are let is that it's let not just on price, but also on social value. And that covers a range of things like the apprenticeship things you leave, and also whether, for example, the contractor has signed up to the Armed Forces Covenant or what have you. And there's a whole range of items which we go through relevant to each particular contract to ensure that we are getting good social value. And many of the points that you raise are things that are looked at in there. And I think it's something that's pleased that this council has done for quite a few years now, that we've looked beyond the idea of the old days of the best value panel for those of us that are old enough to remember it, and look now at what we're doing commercially to produce good value. So I can assure you that it's been done. And also with voids, I think one point that we need to draw attention to now is that the condition that properties are being left in these days is often considerably worse than they used to be. And that requires a great deal more work. And partly this is due to the low turnover of properties, that we're only getting back, in some cases, properties that have been allowed by the tenants to get into a very bad state before we've been able to take action against them. And that is causing difficulties. But clearly, with the problems that we've got with 320 families in temporary accommodation in Colchester, everything we can do to drive the voids down and put another family into a decent home is something that we want to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Ward. Right, I think now I'm going to ask that Mr. Sullivan and the rest of the team just give us their brief introduction to the very meaty report that we have in front of us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. The purpose of the report is to brief committee on the new regulatory regime for housing that commences from the 1st of April, and also to provide an update on Colchester Borough Homes' performance. Just to provide some context, I can advise that CBH manages around 5,600 general needs homes, 560 homes for older persons, and 1,000 leasehold properties, just to provide that context on behalf of the City Council. If I can highlight in the report 4.3, which highlights that from April of this year, we will be entering into a new regulatory regime overseen by the Regulator of Social Housing, and the regulator will proactively monitor landlords' compliance with the new consumer standards. Those standards are set out in 4.6 of the report. You'll also see in 4.7 of the report that it will include provider inspections. So there will be inspections taking place of landlords, including the City Council and Colchester Borough Homes. In 4.10, it refers to the new suite of tenant satisfaction measures that we are required to collect, and also the legislation, the Social Housing Regulation Act, that was passed in the summer of 23, introduces powers to set competency and conduct standards for housing staff. There is a current consultation out from the government on that. Committee is being asked to consider and note the medium-term delivery plan performance at 3 at Appendix 1 and the 24-25 targets at Appendix 2. And then specifically with regard to the new regulatory environment commencing in April, 5.1 of the report sets out the proposal for quarterly reporting to this committee that will provide the information for councillors to challenge and gain assurance of compliance through CBH's work with the new regulatory framework. It will also provide greater visibility of social housing regulation in general and of CBH's performance. With regard to the tenant satisfaction measures referred to in 4.10 of the report, the full set of benchmarks data will be reported once that's been collated by the regulator after the June 2024 submission. In advance, a suite of metrics with our current performance is set out at Appendix 3. We've got some recent highlights, particularly in respect of health and safety, and some challenges, and damper mould is one that we've picked up on. And in 7.1, where we refer to 458 the cases requiring an inspection, these are specifically damper mould related inspections, as opposed to our wider stock condition surveys, where we inspect 100% of properties on a 5-yearly cycle. You'll see in 7.3, one of our challenges has been our void relet time. And before finalising and going to the recommendations, if I could just hand over to Karen to provide a bit more information in terms of our void relet position.
Thank you. And this actually picks up on some of the issues that Councillor Warren's raised. And I would say it's a multifaceted process that we often do put under the spotlight and look at the process there. But this has been an improved position. So we're really pleased to see that the position at the end of Q2 at 42.1 days had improved to 32 at the end of December. I'm reassured to tell you that at the end of January that had improved to 29 days, and we're fairly confident that we'll meet near or near about the 28-day target by the end of year. And that is because we've done some of the things that Councillor Warren suggested. We have those in place, weekly meetings, good communication, multifaceted processes in place. So all of those things are underway. What happened differently this year is we had a new contractor start. So the beginning part of the year was a new contractor bedding in. That is all working really quite efficiently now. So we're confident moving forward that we can maintain that level of performance.
Thank you. And so if I could just highlight then the recommendations in section 2 of the report, and they are in 2.1, committee is invited to note the performance targets for 24-25, make any comments or recommendations to the portfolio holder, and committee is also asked to agree the new reporting arrangements as set out in section 5 of the report. Thank you.
Thank you. You've taken on my responsibility there. But yeah, and I'm sure that the portfolio holder for housing will listen intently and participate extensively in the discussion around this report this evening. Right, I've got an indication from Councillor Harris, Councillor Sunnox and Councillor Dundas. So Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. I find myself obviously agreeing with a lot of what Councillor Ward said, specifically over the regulator responsibility for us to do the inspections from April onwards. That's, as he said, is a long time coming. And my mum-in-law, still in the Colchester Homes house after all these years, and been there for decades, and she remembers a time when inspections used to come around regularly in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but stopped there on in. But these regulator, this law that came in last year is bringing that back in again. My first question, Chair, is I'm assuming, and I'm guessing the answer is going to be a resounding yes, we've got the trained staff, the coach staff, the people in staff now to do those inspections immediately, so that we're actually hit the ground running. There may be some reskilling, maybe some upskilling or some coaching, but I'm guessing that's in place now in Colchester Homes. And my second question, really, so that I don't come back again, is about the wide gambit of stuff that Colchester Home does, the homelessness and the temporary housing that we provide, etc., and the advice. That seems to me, from what I've heard from the portfolio for housing, the cabinet and others, with 300 rising and not getting any better, where we're putting people in temporary accommodation. With Colchester Homes managing all of that, it's a huge struggle, I think, We've got to recognise that, and we've got to make sure that we allow for that, and make sure that somewhere along the line, I don't think it's going to get any better anytime soon. I dread to say that, but I think that's a fact of life. We've just got to make sure that we with the arm's length and Culture Homes and ourselves are ready for that, and I'm sure the portfolio holder recognises that and is well aware. But those are my two questions, really, that we've got to, are we making sure that the homelessness temporary accommodation situation is catered for, and are we ready for those inspections? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harris, and you've picked up on one of my questions as well this evening, and that is, how are we upskilling the staff that work for CBH, and what do we do, would be my adjunct to that, what do we do for any individual who may not wish to upskill or may not be capable of upskilling? So I'll throw the points that Councillor Harris has just made back to you, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you. Again, really important points. On the trained staff, there's two elements to that. First, in terms of preparedness for the new inspection regime, that will be very much focused on senior staff, for example, myself, board members of Colchester Borough Homes and councillors. We have the skills collectively in response to that, but we, will always need to be alert to that challenge and prepare. And so we have an eye to some preparatory work in terms of an inspection, so that we are collectively as prepared as we can be to show the good work that collectively Colchester City Council and CBH does. Operationally, we have very good staff. The inspection will focus on the senior staff, including myself. Just very briefly, there is the additional requirement under the new legislation that's out for consultation at the moment on competency for staff. That will relate to a number of managers and senior executives. Consultation's live, it's just come out. We have reviewed that in detail. We have actually briefed all staff on it, and we are preparing for that. But we're in a fortunate starting position that we have some very able, competent staff. In terms of the pressures on homelessness and temporary accommodation, it is intense at the moment. You're right to highlight that. I think the City Council, Colchester Borough Homes, we're doing what we reasonably can in response to that. But it does highlight the important points made this evening about reletting every property as quickly as possible, about what options we have got in terms of temporary accommodation and broadening them out. But it's impacting on individuals' lives, the need for them to be in temporary accommodation, and it brings financial pressures to the City Council as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that last point's a really important one, isn't it? And it's pleasing to hear that the void time has come down to 29 days, but even 29 days means that a unit is out of action for a 12th of the year, doesn't it? And that means that someone is not being housed. So with 12 units, that's a whole year of housing that's not available. But it's pleasing to hear that you're working on that, and it is going in the right direction. Councillor Sunnock.
Yes, I wanted to try and understand a little bit more about the roles of different parties in this. So we're the Governance and Audit Committee. I think we're taking a shareholder role here. And I'm worried that we're playing children's football and all running after the operational balls, and not thinking. We need to be thinking as shareholders, what are our interests? Are we exercising our responsibilities as shareholders correctly? And most of all, are we focused on the management company, or which is what I think we're doing, and leaving the portfolio relatively unlooked at? Now, these performance indicators cover the portfolio, so I think we can know that there's an intense focus. This is the most comprehensive suite of performance indicators you could imagine. I mean, it's 50 odd pages of it, and so we can be satisfied we're looking at that. But are we really benchmarking ourselves? Are we looking at the HRA and those assets, our biggest assets for the council? Are we focusing in the right way on that? Should we be spreading CBH board's responsibility more to looking at the finances of the HRA, or does that lie somewhere else? And I'm very confused about where I think we've got a vacuum there. So my first question is about who's responsible for what, and shouldn't we be trying to play our places on the field? My next question is about benchmarking. I've been asking and asking and asking. We've got these benchmarking reports. It's repeated again on page 11 in these papers, in the minutes, that our costs, we're so cost efficient that we're 2 million cheaper than our competitors and all that stuff. I can't see that from the accounts. I'm seeing it the other way around. I looked at Tendering's accounts. They're spending on management about £768 of property. Now, it's probably completely different properties, but we're spending £1,800 of property. I've been asking and asking and asking. We need to see those benchmarking figures reconciled back to the accounts, and then we'll feel they're really anchored. So I'm going to ask that once more and see if anything pops out. My last question is around managing the portfolio. We've got a homelessness problem, and we need to make sure that the 5,900 dwellings that we have are allocated as efficiently as we can. What are we doing to manage out those who are absentee landlords, subletting bigger houses than they need? Could we not be more proactive about that and release some properties for people who are in desperate need?
Okay, thank you, William. I'm not sure that Philip and the others are going to be able to answer the questions that you're raising about HRA, but we've got HRA on the agenda a little bit later. So if Philip can't, we'll see what we can do when we get to that point. I think the other questions, though, I'm going to pass back to you and the team, Philip.
Thank you. So specifically in terms of, just 2 or 3 points, and hopefully I'll cover them adequately for you, Councillor. One of the key roles going forward, as set out in this report, is that this committee will be the route for the council to gain assurance on the new regulatory consumer standard. And through this committee, full council will get that through the minutes of this meeting. That's an expectation of the regulator, that what assurance do councillors have that we are adhering to the new regulatory framework? So I think that's really important. You're also very right. Our metrics, we have lots of metrics. We are scrutinised in a lot of detail. The CPH board scrutinises our performance in a lot of detail. We have committees that do exactly that. We also work very closely with the portfolio holder to make sure that we are visible, transparent and scrutinised and challenged. But this committee, as the shareholder committee, also has an important role there. The HRA isn't managed by CPH. There is a review taking place looking at the makeup of the HRA, and there is a briefing, and that's in terms of the efficiency and making sure that is a viable HRA rather than management of the HRA. There is a briefing for this committee later in March, I believe, on that detail, so that's coming through on that. In terms of the benchmarking data, I mean, genuinely, I'm sorry that we've not been able to reconcile the figures with you. What I can say, and I'm not sure if this is repeating, and if it is, I apologise, what you already know, but almost certainly when the figures came to scrutiny, it would have shown that our figures compared to peers, and I can share this with you again, and I'm happy to meet with you again to discuss it, indicated when it went to scrutiny at the end of 2022 that we were just under £3 million more cost effective than our peers. I know the minutes refer to £2 million, but I've picked up on reading the minutes to make sure I had the information available. And in fact, a subsequent report by Housemark, independent benchmarking organisation, indicated that we were just over £3 million more efficient. And I am happy to share that with this committee. What I would say, and again, I appreciate that you will fully understand this, but not all of our costs will fit into that. So, for example, we undertake certain functions for the council, for example, homelessness, housing options. We've been responsible for the management and the upkeep of corporate buildings. They won't be in those figures. Okay? They are separate, but they will be in our accounts. So there could be some very clear reasons, but I appreciate that may not give you the level of detail this evening, but I would be happy to you and to share that benchmark data with this committee, Chair.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, I think that would be useful if you could share it with all members of the committee. And I take your point. We need to be absolutely crystal clear, because I know, you know, how important it is about getting benchmarking to you, Councillor Sunnucks, and getting the figures accurate, but we need to be cautious whenever we're doing comparators that we are comparing apples with apples and not apples with oranges, which we might be on occasion, because the way that tendering is reporting their management costs might be different in terms of what they're calculating that at as compared to how we're doing it at Colchester. But I think that's something for us to go away and have a look at. And just a reminder, let me just finish, Councillor Sun. So just a reminder that one of the two things that we're asked to do this evening is to note the targets and make any comments or recommendations to the portfolio holder. I think there were one or two suggestions that you were making, one or two queries that you were teasing out there that I'm sure Councillor Smith will take on board and take away with him. I'm just wondering, Philip, whether at this point Esme wants to comment on anything as chair of the board.
Thank you. Only to say that sort of on a scrutiny level, the board, we've got a number of committees, so we're going toward this performance summary, and we're all eager to hear about the HRA review and everything that falls out of that. So I think that's what I really have to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll come back to you now then, Councillor Sunnuck.
Yes, a breakdown of those management costs as to what we're doing that other people aren't doing, I think would be very interesting and revealing, and understanding how that overlaps or doesn't overlap with the costs that are in the cost centres in the council's own accounts. So in my mind, the HRA is like a housing association, and but it seems to be doing more than the housing association. It'd be very interesting to know what. And then the other thing is about the management of the portfolio and the allocation of the portfolio, and making sure that it's used for the people who really need it.
Thank you. Jeff, is there something you wanted to come back on that final point?
Just wanted to add a couple of things on from the council's point of view. Ultimate responsibility for compliance and regulation rests with the council, not with the ALMO. And this committee, as the shareholder committee, need to be assured that what they're telling you is true, and that will come around in terms of the constructive challenge that you spoke about earlier on. But when it comes to things like inspections, what you can probably expect is the regulator will be sitting in on this meeting, listening to that constructive challenge taking place.
Thank you. Right, Councillor Dundas.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, CBH team, for the report. Just a couple of very brief comments, really. In the narrative around the performance indicators, particularly around complaints, there's a phrase in there which just says, complaints are becoming more complicated. I just wondered if perhaps you could expand on that a little bit, perhaps give a little bit more of I think we've probably got some ideas of the reasons why, but perhaps a little bit as to exactly what's going on. And secondly, and I appreciate the figures are derived differently, but in our own benchmarking figures, we have complaint satisfaction of 74%. But if we look at on page 107, the tenant satisfaction levels, which is stated, we have 33% satisfaction with how complaints are handled. So there's a slight discrepancy there. I mean, I appreciate that we might think a complaint, or CBH might think a complaint has been handled well, but perhaps the tenant doesn't. And similarly with the antisocial behaviour, there's 54% satisfaction. I also recognise that it may well be that somebody who the complaint was against might not be very satisfied with the way it was resolved, but I just wondered if you could perhaps comment on those and perhaps say what you think CBH can do to improve those figures over the coming year.
Thank you. If I start, and then Karen may want to come in. On the complaints becoming more complicated, there's several reasons. I would say a key one, Councillor, is because of the external environment we're operating in. There's a huge amount more focus from the Housing Ombudsman. And for example, we have had a case that went against us where we tried to assist someone in respect of antisocial behaviour. It was to do with a boundary issue from memory. And we were criticised for that because it was slightly outside of our remit to do that. So with the best of intentions, we acted, but actually we had a finding against us, which meant that it was perceived as a negative. So that would be one example why they're becoming more complicated. I think rightly they have more focus, because I think as a sector we need to be improving what we do. CBH, everyone as a sector, I think we need to move in that direction. But sometimes it's complicated when you try and do the right thing, and actually you are criticised for doing that by an external party. In terms of complaint satisfaction, the difference is an unusual one, because the higher satisfaction is with those individuals who have been through the complaints process. The lower satisfaction is a perception survey based on what would you say if you went through the process. So it's two different types of survey. I don't take any comfort from anything that's not very high in terms of satisfaction levels, but arguably it's positive that those individuals who experience the service are actually 40% more satisfied than the perception survey. And in terms of antisocial behaviour, I'll probably bring Karen in terms of more detail on that, but I think your observations I would support as well, but I don't know if there was anything to add on that, Karen.
I think all I was going to do is explain a little bit the two sets of data that we have on page 71. Philip's really just explained some of that. The top set of data is live data that we benchmark at the end of each month. So that comes from general actual data from tenants. So transactional data, so where it says satisfaction with repairs or antisocial behaviour, it will be people who have actually experienced it. The bottom set, tenant satisfaction measures, that's an annual survey of about 20% of our tenants. So those views are of those 20% of our tenants once a year. So it is a perception rather than actual. So that's the difference in the two levels of satisfaction.
Thank you. And I think probably we will want to look when this report comes back to us next municipal year at whether or not that's improving, or well, hopefully it's improving. Councillor Dundas, I'm going to come back to you.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Also, just another thought. When we're looking at these complaints figures, are they just tenant complaint figures? Because in my experience, actually the complaints sometimes are not from CBH tenants, they are from other people, often neighbouring properties, which are sometimes privately owned, about the CBH property or about the CBH tenant. Trees growing up drain pipe seems to be probably one of the most common ones I've come across. So are these figures just from our tenants, or are they from all the complaints we've received, regardless of where from?
They're all of the complaints. And as you say, they do include complaints from third parties, people who live in the area, the neighbourhood, who may be complaining about a tenant or something in the neighbourhood.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Smith.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the councillors for their contributions to what they put forward here. The whole environment that Colchester Borough Homes faces is becoming increasingly complex because of the levels of regulation that's coming in from the government, with the aim of driving up and improving standards, which is a good thing. But that comes with a cost. There's not only the costs of the inspection, but also the cost of preparation. And one of the things that CBH is doing is they're arranging for a dummy inspection to take place so that when they can learn any lessons from that can be applied for when the real inspections turn up. And there's a role for councillors in that as well, that's already been pointed out. we need to be able to demonstrate, as we're doing here tonight, that we are holding CBH to account and reflecting the views that are coming through from our residents. And I think in the whole, what we're seeing is a very positive picture. When we look at the performance figures, they are generally good. There are certainly weak spots, and I would certainly agree the issues on voids is one that we need to improve on. But we've also, and to give Councillor Harris some comfort, when it comes to the homelessness, I receive weekly reports on the figures that come through. So I can tell you that as of last week, it was 320. That's down from 322. Way too high still. But it shows the problems that we're facing. And one of the proofs of that was that we actually held a housing summit a couple of weeks ago at Essex University for the North Essex councils. I'm pleased to say that from Colchester, there were councillors from all three main groups attending that summit. There were also eight chief executives out of the 9 councils represented, showing how important the homelessness situation is for councils, not just because of the demands on the general fund, but also because of the human impact of having, as in our cases, 91 families in bed and breakfast accommodation this week in Colchester. Councillor, you're quite right to ask what we're doing to try and use the properties more efficiently. And I think in page 103 of the report, it sets out quite a lot of the things that are actually taking place to try and encourage people. And we're looking particularly through Home Choice, which is how all the properties that Colchester, and indeed I think it's 7 other councils use to allocate properties to ensure they're allocated absolutely fairly. There's no question that Councillor X can put in a good word for someone and get them bumped up the list. That is totally impossible under the bidding system that Home Choice has. Sadly, actually, Tendring Council isn't a member, which is a great pity. And one of the other things we do, and again, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear about this, is we do have local lettings policies. So we have some new properties in your ward, which I've just agreed a local lettings policy for, to give priority with a local connection to that village. So those people get first choice of them if they're in the same band as somebody else. Clearly, a band A priority will still take preference over band D, but we're doing that to do our very best to make it. And one key thing that we've done this year is the switch to affordable rents on new properties, because as we'll come on to the financials, I know that's the next item, later on the agenda, but we're finding all social housing providers are finding budgets becoming increasingly tight. And what we've done this year is to move, so new properties are now being let at affordable rents, 70% of the market rent, rather than social rent, 50%. And that generates more income for the housing revenue account, which enables them to provide better services and to tackle some of the issues that we're seeing that are leading to some of the complaints. So all in all, what I'm seeing is a very positive situation in very, very challenging circumstances. And I think we should be commending the work that CBH are doing on our behalf in delivering a frontline service for nearly 6,000 households, plus the leaseholders across this city. And looking again at the targets, we do need to keep a close eye on them. I think they're achievable, but one thing that we have asked for is that sometimes we've changed targets to fit in with new government guidelines. We're keeping the monitoring under the old system as well, so we have the comparison. So for example, on lettings, we're bringing in now new categories of properties which will increase the letting times. It's not just going to be general needs properties, but we're going to monitor against the old target as well. so we can see that that 28-day target is being met under the old standards, as well as what the one is under the new standards to fit in with the government guidelines. So I think that's very encouraging. So I certainly commend this report to you.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. Yeah, there is a lot in this report, and I want to thank you and the team for producing this, giving us the opportunity to look at it. I noticed that a number of the metrics are either at 99% plus or even 100%, which is commendable. There are some that are not where we would want them to be, and I recognise that you recognise that and are working on it. I was particularly exercised as well with paragraph 7 on page 59, 7.2, where it talks about repairs timing, and 89% appears to be good, but if I was the 1 in 10 waiting for my repair, I wouldn't think it was so good. And I suppose it depends on what that repair is as well. You know, if we're talking about a door handle on a kitchen cabinet, not so important. We're talking about a toilet that's not flushing, that's a different matter, isn't it? So I'd like to see that improving over the coming 12 months. And I think Councillor Smith makes an important point about the state of the nation when it comes to housing at the moment. I know that Councillor Warnes, with his expertise and knowledge, was saying to me as a colleague ward councillor 2 years ago now that there were going to be major issues once the COVID stay on evictions came to an end for local authorities up and down the country. And we're seeing that, unfortunately, and that puts pressure on CBH, it puts pressure on housing across the piece, but most importantly, it puts pressure on those households who find themselves evicted through absolutely no fault of their own. So I haven't seen any other indications. We've got 2 recommendations to invite and note performance targets. I think we've done that. Make comments and recommendations to the portfolio holder, and I'm sure that Councillor Smith will take away the comments that have been made this evening, and also to agree to that the new reporting arrangements as set out in section 5 of the report going forward. All agreed? Agreed. Right, thank you very much. Okay, just quickly look at the time. Yep, we've got time. So, right, the next item on the agenda is the draft statement of accounts 22-23. And I was having quite a detailed conversation with Councillor Sunnox before the meeting this evening. And I did ask Matthew Evans to go away and just have a look and see whether or not we could fit in some sort of meeting just to look at the draft statement of accounts for 22-23 before the end of the municipal year. Any joy?
Chair, yeah, I'd have to consult with colleagues, but yeah, certainly it's something that I think we could accommodate. I'm not able to offer you any specific dates yet. There are a couple I think might work towards the end of March or potentially beginning of April, but I would have to speak before confirming if that's okay. But I think the short answer is yes, we could do that.
All right. So I know from my discussion with Councillor Sunnox and with Councillor Dundas that there are quite a few questions and comments that they would like to make about those draft accounts, and also where we find ourselves in terms of audited accounts as a local authority. I'll just repeat what I've repeated ad nauseum throughout the year, that I don't think we find ourselves in a position that is of our making as a council, but it's a position that a number of local authorities find themselves in because of the auditing situation around the country. However, that said, I recognise the professional qualification that Councillor Sunnox has and his concerns about the detail of the draft accounts. So I think it probably makes more sense, rather than us tiptoe around them this evening, to adjourn item 9 and bring that back as a one-off item meeting in very late March or very early April, subject to Mr. Evans going away and being able to confirm a suitable date. Are we all happy with that? I'm seeing Councillor Sunnox and Councillor Naylor indicating. I also just want to ensure that our Section 151 officer is comfortable with that as well. Councillor Sunnox.
Yes, I think that's a very sensible suggestion, Chair, and it brings takes the pressure off this evening. There is one thing that we need to address and that we shouldn't push forward, and that is the consultation on the new deadline for getting audited accounts, 30th of September this year, expires in 2 days' time. And I'm very keen that the Council protects itself by making a substantive response to that, explaining that I think we should be saying that we support the deadline, we support something that will bring the whole thing to resolution, but that a resolution mechanism for those who don't make the deadline is needed, and we should take the opportunity to explain why it is that we're finding it so difficult to get there. So I think we need to sort of make our case and a consultation response doesn't get listened to probably anyway, but in preparing it and agreeing it, we will hopefully come to a strategy as to how we can resolve what's now become, in my view, an extremely serious backlog on the audit.
Thank you. And I know that you've circulated your thoughts about what that response to consultation should be.
I've circulated the summary I've just given you verbally, but I do have a detailed and quite repetitive response because it's answering their questions. I'm happy to circulate now if anyone's interested.
So I'm happy for you to circulate that to all of us, and I'm sure if you circulated it to the leader of the council, he would take on board what he felt was appropriate when finalising the council's response to that consultation exercise. Councillor Naylor?
Thank you, Chair. With regard to the timing of the additional meeting, can I just flag, obviously the HRA briefing is on the 26th, and I think it would be beneficial if we had that briefing before the second meeting and also be given a degree of time afterwards to reflect on what we've learned in that briefing and how it then relates to the accounts, the draft statement of accounts.
A valid point. We've been trying to organise the HRA briefing for a little while now. We've finally got a date, and I'm taking on board what you say. It also just happens that I am away for a week anyway, so it probably moves it into early April rather than the end of March, which does give us a little bit of time to digest the online briefing that we'll have on HRA on the 26th of March. Councillor Dundas.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm not going to mention the 22-23 because we've just discussed we're going to do that at a later date. But just going back to the previous years, 2021, 21-22, which is referred to in paragraph 1.3. Obviously, we've had BDO here, and that was a few months ago. On those years, in terms of the relationship with BDO, who's caught, for want of a better expression, is the ball in? Who is now waiting for whom in terms of taking it to the next stage of actually trying to get at least 2021 signed off? Have we given them everything? We're now waiting for them, or vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, that's one of on my to-do list next week to get the very latest on that. But I can assure you that BDO are very active on both 2021 audit. And also now they're beginning to become active on the 21-22 audit. But in terms of the, the precise details. Clearly, this has just come out. My next task for next week is to get behind what that really means in the context of, the backstop date. So I'm not quite clear in my own mind exactly what that looks like, the 21-22 audit, to be honest, as of this evening.
So if I can just clarify then, Chris, once you have clarity on what's happening, could you just send a brief update to members of the committee, please?
Sorry, could I make just one comment? We've received this afternoon a list of detailed sort of questions on the accounts, which is fair enough. I mean, a lot of them are of an audit type nature, I would argue. But that takes a little bit of time for the team to do, and we're now in the preparations for the 23-24 statement of accounts is my main priority now. So I'd ask for a little bit of forbearance in terms of pulling the team off the 23-24 accounts, if that's possible, Chairman, through you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate and understand that. Councillor Sunnucks, you indicated, I'm just going to allow you briefly to come back.
Yes, very quickly. Trying to resolve this backlog is going to be an incredible amount of work. What matters is the future, and what matters desperately is our balance sheet. What about just accepting qualifications for the earlier years and concentrating on the latest years? I'm trying to find ways of helping. On the questions, I still haven't had answers to my questions on the 2022 accounts. So I do hope, they're happy to give time and happy to be patient and everything else, but I do hope we get answers to these to my questions there. And they're not an auditor's questions. They're questions that we, as responsible councillors, ought to be asking. And I'm not nitpicking questions. Why I put those down at the bottom. They're not very important. The typos and the things that don't reconcile. There's loads of them. They're easy to find. But it's and I'm only asking the questions that go to the root. I've only had time really to look at the HRA part of the accounts. There's other parts like the pension and the collection fund that I haven't really understood. And that's why I feel we need that separate meeting. We actually need to go through it. And I hope that the questions will point in the right direction as to what's really important for the council. I'm not just asking them to be clever or anything like that. I'm asking them because I think they're really important issues that we as a committee should be addressing.
Thank you. Andrew, at this stage, is there anything you want to add?
I'm in the committee's gift, really, Chairman. I would say, of course, the accounts are for noting at this stage. They're not for approval. I mean, that is the audit process, really, one way or the other, and then they'll come back to the committee with the auditor's comments for the committee to agree the accounts. And at that point in time, there aren't any issues in terms of accuracy, either identified by the auditors or the committee themselves, will be kind of reflected in the final version of the accounts. But so this was for the committee to note, really, more than anything else. I would say on the HRA concerns that have been flagged, I think there's, I think it's important to note that our treatment in relation to depreciation of major repairs contributions hasn't changed over many, many years. So, in that regard, I'm satisfied that the preparation of the accounts in front of the committee are correct in relation to the HRA. And I think it's, I think it's been conflated with issues about future provision for repairs as opposed to a correct statement within the accounts and the historic accounts at this point in time. And I think, we do need to consider the issue about provision for major repairs separately. So I think the two issues being brought together. One's a forward-looking issue. The other one is historic. The accounts, I think, are correct in that regard. But, as I say, I'm in the committee's gift in terms of how they want to approach this. In relation to the the consultation deadline, which is on Thursday evening. Chair, I've sent you a draft of how we might respond to that. I think largely I accept, as does Councillor Sunnock, that that we are in a position whereby, regrettably, I think we have to accept that the current situation needs a resolution, and drawing a line under it is probably the only solution really to move us forward. I think that will inevitably require qualifications to accounts, and including, I suspect, almost inevitably accounts for Colchester. In fact, there's three different options available to the auditors to be fleshed out in terms of what they actually mean, and that's unqualified, qualified, and disclaimed. And I suspect, as at the end of December, there were 777 audits outstanding across the country. And I think, with NHS work still to be completed, which starts imminently, I think, for the audit firms, the prospect of the majority of those accounts being resolved, unqualified, I think, by the end of September is negligible, I feel. So what we'll end up is in a situation of many qualified accounts or disclaimed accounts, more likely, I think, at the end of September, and that will have ramifications for future years. The government talks in a consultation about rebuilding trust, but I think, for me, I think from a public's perspective, I think trust is binary in that regard. Either your accounts are unqualified or they're qualified, and I think unless they are unqualified, I think trust doesn't actually get rebuilt. But we're likely to see a number of years' worth of qualified accounts up and down the country because of the need to conclude audits without auditors gaining assurance on brought forward balances, which will just be the nature of, I think, the audit landscape, I think, for the next few years. That's probably all I wanted to say. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Small. With that in mind then, and all the comments and remarks that we've heard this evening, I'm proposing that we don't deal with the draft statement of accounts 22-23 this evening, that we leave it to Mr. Evans to find a suitable date for us as soon as it's practicable, and we come back, and that is our only item on the evening. All agreed? Thank you. Okay, let's move on to item 10 then, Treasury Management Outturn. Are you leading on this, Chris?
Okay, thank you, Chair. Item 10 then, Treasury Management Outturn Report, which is on pages 227 to 231 of the agenda this evening. Just a very brief update on the Treasury Management Outturn for 22-23, which basically ties up a loose end following the publication of the Statement of Accounts, which we just talked about. The report shows that borrowing declined marginally from 161.1 million in the year to 156.6 million, and investments decreased from 64.5 million to 32.5 million. Importantly, the Section 151 officer confirms compliance with the PWLB rules and the SIPFA code as well as following the advice of Link, our Treasury Management Advisors on investments. And finally, Treasury Management activity was carried out throughout the year in full compliance with the Council's Treasury Management indicators. I'd just like to pick up on one point spotted by Councillor Smith at the briefing. The paragraph 6.4 on page 228, there is a weighted average maturity there for banks, which is not 70.1 years. It is actually 54 years to be factually correct. And the council did actually take out a couple of 70-year loans back in the early to late noughties. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Councillor Dundas.
Yeah, very, very briefly, just on the big drop on investments, is that just a timing issue over money we have come in and going out, as to why we've got such a large drop there?
With regard to 22-23, yes, because there has been since then a deliberate move towards running down our investment balances, and I would hope that at the end of this year we'll have a lower figure still. We're aiming for a £20 million cash buffer so that we can absolutely minimise our borrowing as far as we can. And so the general trend is definitely downwards, but clearly we have to have a cash buffer there to avoid running into an overdraft position. So we're moving from one to the other, but as you'd rightly identified, the position oscillates throughout the year as the cash ebbs and flows through the system.
Councillor Summings.
Yes, I've got a question on paragraph 8.4, which is the operational boundary and authorised limit for external debt. Do any of those, it looks as if we've got loads of headroom within all our treasury management indicators. Is any of that an effective constraint on our activities? Do any of them worry you? And to me, it's that our reserves are the constraint on our activities. I'm trying to see whether there's anything else.
I mean, it's a constraint in the sense that it depends what you mean by a constraint, but it's a boundary, as the name suggests, a controlled borrowing within accepted limits. So those boundaries are set in accordance with our capital financing requirement, with a little bit of buffer in there around the preset payments and the like. So there is a calculation made at the start of the year. The reason for the headroom is simply the slippage in the capital programme. So as the capital programme slips, then you don't need to borrow as much, so therefore you don't get anywhere near the various boundaries and the authorised limits that you set. So that's what's going on.
As I'm seeing it, the Treasury controls are nowhere near biting, whereas the reserve controls are right on our backside, and it's therefore those we should be looking at. The other question I've got is that the questions I've got are more forward-looking, and I might be told it's out of bounds, but the fact that we haven't got a Treasury management statement with our budget, what consequences will that have for us? And the budget assumption that we can borrow in the future at 2.8%, can we see a copy of the advice that supports that?
The first answer to your question is there are no consequences to that. So it's recommended good practice rather than any legislative requirement. So the fact that I think the legislation says that we are to have due regard to the code, and I think I'm pretty confident that Section 151 officer would confirm that we do, and that's set out in this report. It's good practice to have the code of practice laid there before the full council and accepted, and that is coming forward going into 23-24. So I'll look at what we've got in terms of the forecast interest rates, but once again I go back and emphasise that is just a forecast, and like everybody else, Treasury management advisors and economists worldwide have got their projections wrong in the past, and it is only forecast 4 or 5 years hence. So the key forecast, of course, being the year in front in the budget.
Can I suggest that when we come to the HRA review, it's going to be of critical importance. That interest forecast is going to be absolutely critical importance, and that we make sure we have a market-based forecast. So the gilt market provides you with a forecast from players, not scribblers, okay? It's a very deep market. It'll tell you what the expectations are of interest rates at every point for the next 50 years, virtually in depth. And we really need to have market-based forecasts, not, as I call them, scribbler-based forecasts. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of statistical fact. And I'm sure our Treasury advisors would support that approach. I'd be really surprised if they didn't.
I'm sure that Andrew and Chris will use whatever is appropriate to ensure that they're making the right forecasts. I would just suggest, William, that 18, 20 months ago, even those who you are suggesting are in the know, or mostly in the know, would not have been projecting that inflation would hit 11% within just a few months from then. So forecasts for inflation and for interest rates are always a little bit miss as well as hit, I would suggest.
I would agree on inflation, but emphatically not on interest rates. There is a market out there.
Andrew.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say, Chairman, that the information provided by Link is provided by tied economists through tied economic companies that they work with, really. So it does come from the city. It comes from the economists in that space. PWLB rates are inextricably linked to the gilt market because they're actually, I think they are gilts plus, I think it's 0.8 or 1%, depending upon which particular PWLB rate you're using. But they are forecasts of the bond and gilt yield market, really, one way or the other. So they are the best reflection that the city has, and we use a firm of economists through Link, but we also use a firm of economists through our advisors at Epping Forest as well. And we compare the two to make sure that we are using a central forecast for future years. And I think the one thing that we can be sure of, as you said, really, is those forecasts will be wrong, because they always are. But what we're doing is setting a budget for next year and then forecasts for the years thereafter. And every year we revisit their forecasts based upon the updated information that's available at that point in time, the most accurate information at that point in time. But it's a rolling forecast. So it always takes account of the latest predictions of where the market is heading. And that's what we use in our planning for future years. What we do is we constantly check and adjust and replan, which is what the whole purpose of the medium-term financial forecast is, both on the general fund and the HRA. Constant readjustments based upon updated information. It's not stuck in or set in stone from the moment we make the forecast. We continually readjust it based upon the latest market information. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andrew.
My concern is that we've done a budget based on a 2.8% that I can't see in any of the yield curves. And I think it's quite an important factor for the future. So we got the opportunity with the HRA review to re-look at it, and the request is to base it on market rates.
Thanks, William. I've heard everything you've said. I think we have. Chris is just going to come back. Then I've got Paul, as indicated, and then I'm proposing that we close this item down. Chris?
Sorry, just for the benefit of the committee, we set the budget on 4.8% interest assumption. It wasn't 2.8%, so just to reassure you.
I thought it was higher than 2.8, but without the paper in front of me. And 4.8 seems about in line with Treasury forecasts, etc. Councillor Dundas.
Yeah, I think the difference might be we're talking about the 4.8 is the assumption over the next year, the 2.8 is the long-term assumption. And actually, for this council, when you look at where most of our borrowing, it is the PWLB rate over the next 10, 20, 30 years, which is probably the key borrowing factor. And it's unpredictable things. I mean, I remember in middle of February 2022, the Rick Press and were saying, well, it's just a load of posturing, Mr. Putin is not going to invade Ukraine. And 2 weeks later, we had a war in Europe and the massive economic shock that has had throughout the world. You can't predict everything, and that's why you do have to err on the side of the caution and actually allow for these things a little bit, because over the next 10, 20 years, 30 years, there will be shocks, there will be events, and you can't assume that, you have to have headroom in there with your borrowing. But just to add, I think also, if you look at the terms of reference of this committee in terms of what we consider, I think a request to actually see the guidance or the report which sets that 2.8% is a perfectly reasonable request for the committee.
You mean the advice that, yeah. All right. And I think Andrew Small has already given us an indication of where that advice comes from. If someone wants that in writing, then I'm sure either Chris or Andrew can provide it. But I'm confident in the response that we've had this evening about the fact that they are doing due diligence on what the appropriate rates are likely to be. But as I think every one of us around this table would vouch for, I don't think, as long as I've been looking at Treasury forecasts now, probably for the last 30 years or so, I don't think I've ever seen a Treasury forecast that was accurate by the time the next budget rolled around. Okay, I'm just conscious of the fact that it is 7 minutes to 8. We've had a fair bit to go through. Councillor Smith, I'm going to bring in and then wrap this item up, and we'll have a break. Councillor Smith.
Thank you. First of all, a question. On 6.4, we talk about our operational boundary, 375 million, compared with our actual debt of 156 million. Could you give us a bit of substance about how we get to that figure of 375 million as our operational boundary? Presumably it's not just someone's dream. And secondly, in answer to some of Councillor Sullivan's points, I remember how good the bankers were in, was it 2008, where they did all manner of things. And in fact, I do recall being heavily criticised for something to do with investments in Icelandic banks when you were following exactly the Treasury guidelines that were put down here. And the final thing is, when it comes to the HRA, it's not the interest rate, the long-term interest rate that's important, it's the difference between the long-term interest rate and CPI. Because our rents go up by CPI plus 1%. And if CPI happened to equal whatever the interest rate was, great, we're on to a winner. If there's a difference, that's when you get a big problem as far as the HRA is concerned. And that's the key determinant, not what the nominal rate is, but what the real rate is.
Right, thank you. I'm not going to rehearse the same arguments again. I think we've done enough on this item. We're just asked to consider the report, and I think we've done that. So I'm going to wrap this item up now, and it's 5:02, and ask you to be back here promptly by 8:05, please. Thank you.
Trish. Great. That's it. Okay. Shh. Okay.
Evening and welcome back to Governance and Audit Committee meeting on the 5th of March 2024. We're moving on to item 11, the verbal update from Section 151 Officer on the Treasury Management Mid-Year Report for 23-24. Over to you, Chris. That's Andrew. Sorry, Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the verbal update. Unfortunately, we've been tied up in terms of budget preparation and producing final accounts and outturn for Treasury Management as well. So we're still playing catch up in terms of producing all of the information we'd expect to produce to the committee. So we did provide some information to Council as part of budget setting on 21st of February about where we currently are, and this, I can update the committee in terms of our current levels of outstanding debt and investments, but recognising that we are bringing the overall reporting up to date. So total borrowing as at 4th of March was £147.5 million. 123 million of that was invested in or was borrowed by the HRA. Our overall borrowing level, as reported to Council on 21st of February, is well below our capital financing requirement of just under £250 million. And borrowing remains well within our operational and authorised boundaries, as we just discussed. Actually, operational boundaries 375 million and unauthorised limit 405 million. So our overall level of debt is still well below that, and is, as has been mentioned, largely due to slippage on the capital programme. That's probably the largest single factor. Total investments as at the 4th of March were £32.8 million. Our investments are currently being deliberately managed downwards, trying to aim for a liquidity buffer of £20 million. That's lower than recent years and minimises our external borrowing requirement. And so that kind of reduces our risk, but also reduces our overall cost of financing costs as well. I can confirm that we fully comply with the Sector Management Treasury Code for 23-24, so all of our limits are as they should be and on below. And our investment activity is being supported by the Council's Treasury Management Advisors, Link, and they provide us with a strict counterparty list as well in relation to investments, and that's kept under constant review, and we don't stray outside of that. So, as I say, more information will come forward on Treasury Management for future meetings, but happy to take any questions on that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andrew. I was reminded that I was remiss at the end of the last item just to get the answer to Councillor Smith's question about the operational boundary limit of 375 million and where that actually comes from. So I wonder if you or Chris can answer that.
I think it's, I mean, Chris might want to come in. It's really an amalgam of all of our overall estimated borrowing requirements, plus cash flow requirement borrowing as well. And then a bit more of headroom to give you an operational boundary, which is the amount that you shouldn't need to exceed. And then an authorised limit, above that really, which is like your line in the sand, really, in theory, in case there are any expected events. It's a calculation, but also an element of, there's an element of subjectivity in there as well on top of that around how much contingency you might need, for example, based upon unlikely or expected potential events. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Any questions for Andrew or Chris at this stage? No, I'm not seeing any hands up. So we've had the verbal update from Section 151 officer, and we'll move on to item 12, Q3 budget monitoring report. Chris, are you leading on this one? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep this brief. Item 12 then, which appears on pages 233 to 257 of your agenda this evening, sets out the Q3 position for 23-24. In other words, the forecast outturn for this, the 23-24 financial year, based on available information as of the 31st of December 2023. Before I go any further though, just to briefly correct a minor presentational issue that has come to my attention. The HRA capital table in paragraph 9.2 on page 244 of the report should have had a variance of 1.493 million on revenue contribution, 12.395 million on borrowing respectively. I'll update the committee after the meeting with that in writing. The more eagle-eyed observer may have noticed that this now brings the table into line with the table in paragraph 7.1 on page 240. Apologies for any confusion caused. My colleague Mr. Brown was on leave and left the amateurs in charge, i.e. me, so that's down to me, I apologise. On to the detail then. The report covers the revenue and capital positions for both the general fund and the housing revenue account. As highlighted in previous quarters this year, Colchester City Council, as with many other councils up and down the country, is experiencing a number of financial challenges as it tries to manage the local impact of what seemingly a never-ending series of shocks to the economy. The table in paragraph 6.1 on page 236 reveals a forecast general fund net revenue overspend of 1.916 million as of the end of December, and this represents a slight deterioration of 469,000 compared to Q2, where there was a 1.447 million overspend forecast at that stage. The key difference, of course, is the pay award for 23-24, which was eventually settled after the Q2 forecast was prepared and presented. So the Q2 forecast didn't include the impact of the additional pay award, as where the Q3 forecast does, and members will recall that the cost pressure was in the region of 600,000. So that is the absolute dominant reason for the difference between the forecast and the two quarters. Other than that, things are very stable on the general fund between the two quarters, with a projected overspend of 2.975 million on service budgets, which is further analysed in appendices A, B and C. And on the plus side, the overspend on service budgets is offset by a projected underspend of 1.808 on capital financing costs. Paragraph 6.2 on page 237 summarises the main spending pressures with a range of challenges being identified within corporate services with a forecast overspend of 913,000, with notable factors behind this including an anticipated shortfall in AMP4 dividends of 289,000. However, as with Q2 and Q1 as well, the biggest spending pressure relates to the homelessness service, which in common with many councils up and down the country is experiencing a surge in demand from service users, which is driving a projected overspend of 822,000, which is very similar to the forecast in Q2. The funding position is presented in a table in paragraph 6.3 on page 146. It shows a mixed picture whilst there's little variation on local tax. At this stage there's some good news in the final local government settlement for 23-24, with previously reported the council receiving 204,000 for the revenue support grant, which was not assumed within the original budget. The table in paragraph 6.6 on page 239 sets out the anticipated use of reserves. Members of the committee are reminded that this includes the anticipated use of the earmarked reserves too. In other words, the spending of available funds as well as the impact of the forecast overspend, which has for the most part been addressed in the base budget for 24-25. The housing revenue account budget presented in paragraph 7.1 on page 240 is projected to be on course, subject to the need to rein back revenue contributions to capital in the light of additional repairs and maintenance costs. And turning briefly to capital, the General Fund Capital Programme presented in section 8 beginning on page 241, including Appendix D. Capital spending has continued to be relatively subdued in Q3, with an overall underspend of 71.024 million now forecast. And a new item for this quarter is the HRA Capital Programme, which is presented before you in section 9, beginning on page 243. As with the general fund, spending has been relatively subdued so far this year, with an overall underspend of 18.244 million forecast for the year end, with slippage of 10.653 million on the Council House new build programme being the largest item. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hartgrove. Firstly, very nice to hear you being so open and honest about the odd minor error, but no need to wear a hair shirt, I assure you. Councillor Harris and then Councillor Dundas.
Oh, yes, hello. Yes, Appendix D on page 257 is the capital fund, general fund capital programme for 23-24. On that list there, under sustainability, there's a whole list of things that got funds targeted for them. Some of those, quite a number of those, were allocated some considerable years ago. And there's money in there, for example, for the Garrison Gym Playground, a subject that's dear to my heart because residents are contacting me all the time about it, Chair. My question is about the forecast spending. It says by the 31st of March, the forecast spending is going to be 306 on that item there. 31st of March is not far away. And we're going to build a playground in 28 days, it says. So my question really is that, bearing in mind some of these projects, including that one, was set 5, 6, 7 years ago, we're not going to get the same value for money now as we would have got then. There's all sorts of reasons why, of course, but are we going to cut our cloth? Probably asking the wrong person, I assume, today, but somebody will be able to answer that, and it's the right place to bring it in public here, to find out whether we're going to tame down what we plan to do there to make sure it's fitted, or whether that project is still a live project. If not, we need to know that, and you certainly need to know that for your accounts, of course. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Harris. And I think, you know, we are all aware around the table that there has been some slippage for too long, I would suggest now, on some of the capital programme and expenditure on capital. Hence the detailed review of capital expenditure that we've seen recently. But I take your point about that one suggesting that it will be done and dusted by the 31st of March. Anything that you want to add, Chris? Thank you. Any other? Oh, sorry, Councillor Dundas.
Thank you. It's alive. Yeah, just a general comment, really. If we look at the use of the reserves and accept that some of these were use of earmarked, particularly around the pension fund, but when the budget was set in February 23, and to put it into context, inflation at the time was 10.4%, and interest rates were 4%. So we knew that the economic background and the shocks around energy prices at the time. You know, we set a budget anticipating use of reserves of 2.23 million. And it looks like we're going to end up using about 6 million. Now, 800,000 of that is temporary accommodation, which perhaps couldn't have been predicted, but equally, the fact that interest rates stayed high benefited us. If that hadn't happened, probably we wouldn't have got the 1.8 million of extra income. We'd be looking at a use of reserves about £7.5 million in 1 year. And that's why it's so important that we as a committee and as a council do really keep a close eye on the reserves, because they look quite generous at the moment. When we look at our overall reserves, you start eating through them at £7 million a year, that doesn't last very long. Now, we've set a budget this year which balances, but there is a danger there that it won't, because events happened, and as happened last year, it didn't come out as predicted. So although we keep banging on about it, a constant observation of what we've got left and what our capacity is over the next few years for absorbing shocks and absorbing unanticipated events is incredibly important. And we also have to bear in mind that under the MTFF, as we approved as a council on the budget, although of course future year forecasts aren't a budget as such, because a new budget will be set next February, under the MTFF at the moment, even assuming all the savings come to fruition, you're still looking at a £7.3 million additional use reserves over the £6 million we've used in this year. Now, I accept that when the budgets are set next February, there will no doubt be alterations, and that hopefully won't happen. But you know, we say these things won't happen, but this year we went from 2.2 to 6, and it could have easily gone to 7 to 7.5. So it can happen. So we just need to be aware of it, really. That's just a general comment.
Okay, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, so
your mic's not on, Chris. Sorry.
Apologies, I've never switched it. I think you make a very good point, and presentationally, it's one of those things that I'm working on at the moment, and the review of the reserves will lead to a different presentation of this as we go forward. We've been working on the development of this, and I hope members of the committee that have been here a while will recognise the progress that we made in this year. But one of the things we're looking at is the way in which the budget's loaded onto, the way in which the budget's adjusted on the system, and that is making the situation seem far worse than it actually is. So the overspend, you're quite right. There's the overspend is reflected in there. The budget pressures around homelessness being the best example. Now, that's actually built in as a growth item into the budget in 24-25. So obviously I can't legislate for something else that might but on that point alone, providing it doesn't get any worse, we should have sufficient in the budget for 24-25. Now, the other stuff that is being spent there in earmarked reserves is one-off funds. So, for example, revenue grants unemployed, it's not unemployed, unapplied, not unemployed. Revenue grants unapplied are, as they say on the tin, they're revenue grants that are just sat there waiting to be applied to whichever particular scheme in question. And as they are drawn down from the reserve, they're then spent in accordance with the conditions in the grant. Now, the way in which it works here is that feeds through into the budget system. It's a presentational point, and it makes the council's use of reserve seem far worse than it actually is. It is quite normal. There is another presentation here that says 1 equals the other, i.e. 0. So, and that is the form of presentation that I hope to bring forward, which will make more sense and it will give you more reassurance about. I know the Councillor Sonics has used the phrase runway on several occasions. I think that's a pretty erudite assessment about what we're talking about here. You need to see exactly what the runway is, that clearer identification of what the runway is. And it's all there, it just needs bringing out.
Thank you, Chris. And I think at this stage, it's appropriate for me to say that the way in which you and the team have been presenting the accounts to us over this municipal year has been much clearer than we previously had. But I accept again your wearing of the hair shirt, that you're getting there but haven't quite got there yet. Thank you. Councillor Smith.
Yes, I'd just like to make a few observations on the HRA side of the equation and the difficulties that we're seeing there. There's a big capital underspend because projects didn't go ahead because they're not viable. This is at a time when we've got record levels of homelessness and people in temporary accommodation. And the problems we're seeing is that with the restrictions on rent that was imposed the previous year by the government, instead of going up by CPI plus 1%, it was capped at 7%. That took an awful lot of money out of the housing revenue account. That meant the projects were no longer viable. That meant there were more people homeless. More people homeless meant a higher bill for temporary accommodation and more pressure on the general fund. And everything is related. Indeed, that comes back to what Councillor Dundas said. Yes, if interest rates had gone down, we'd have got less interest. But if interest rates had gone down, the economy would have been in a better state. The housing market wouldn't have been killed. So therefore, planning would have produced more income, more houses being built, less homelessness. So it is a complex problem, but we do need to look very carefully, particularly at the HRA side, as to how we deal with the situation that at the moment we have a housing stock that is generally very old in Colchester because there hasn't been the new builds. That means that repairs are much higher than they would be with more modern stock. That is eating up the income that's coming in. And we've seen figures suggesting that there may be approximately 700 properties where the repair costs are higher than the rent coming in. That is a very difficult and unsustainable position. But with 320 families in homelessness situations, we're certainly not going to be in a position of saying to those 700 families in those homes that are uneconomic, I'm sorry, we're not making any money out of you. We're going to have to get rid of them. There is a crisis that's facing all local authorities and all housing associations, and that's why we're seeing a lot of housing associations not taking up their properties that are GAP 1 under Section 106 arrangements. And that is what is causing a great deal of financial problems, but also a great deal of human misery. And it's something which I think we all need to be very well aware of, and the problems that we're seeing in the HRA account.
Thank you. Councillor Sunnox.
Yes. I see that we seem to move our budget, and I'm always interested in how that works. And the danger of moving a budget is you lose your bearings. And I'm sure there's good reasons why we do it. And I guess the question is, are we planning to move our budget this year? That's my first question. I've got some others to follow.
A red hot topic. I've had a meeting on that very same subject this morning. So we are looking at alternative approaches, shall we say. I must emphasise that there is no problem with the current system other than it could be more transparent. I would accept that.
It's just a matter of, I'm very much in the party that the budget's the budget. And means if you get an early variance, you have to explain it 4 times in the year, which is a bit of a pain, but at least people know where you are.
But I must caveat that with, you know, that's subject to there not being any constraints on doing that, which is what I've been looking at today. So, but it's been in my sights for several months.
Okay. And the next question is about the complexity of the reserves weaving in and out. I think that on page 238, am I right in thinking that 6039 is the figure that I'm really looking for, which is the difference between what cash comes in, what we spend, and what goes out? I think that's a figure that's unpolluted by reserve movements. Is that a correct assumption?
Sorry, that is a combination of 2 things. So it's a combination of an overspend, which is reported here, virtually £2 million. But on top of that, you've got the application of earmarked reserves. Okay, so if you take an unapplied revenue reserve there, the money comes down from the reserve and it's spent. The sum total is 0. So there is no overspend there. That's the point, and it's a presentational point, and that's one of the reasons what I'm looking at, what I'm doing in terms of presentation going forward to eliminate this debate once and for all around here, and hopefully give you the reassurance that you're looking for, that the council is not overspending any more than that reported.
But what I'm looking for is the simple. The fact that we're going to spend this year 28.7 million, we're going to receive in income 6 million less. So I'm looking at it from the straight P&L point of view. And arithmetically, I think it's correct if this table is correct, because 6 is the balancing figure.
So
I'm trying to find out what our loss is in private sector terms, and I think the answer is it's £6 million.
Okay. Andrew's indicating, so I'm just going to bring Andrew in at this point.
I think there are 2 things. Sorry, Chair. There are 2 things going on in reserves. And some of it, reserves are like a savings account, really. So money you've put away for a specific purpose, and at some point, when you need to spend that money that you've put away for reserves, then it goes out through the revenue account, and you take the money out of the reserves to offset it. So it's not like a structural deficit in the budget. It's money you spent because you know you've got the money in the reserve. So you wouldn't have spent it if you didn't have the money in the reserve. So as I say, it's not a difference in terms of money coming in, money going out. It's you actually apply money you've put away in a previous year.
Okay, I get the answer. Yeah. I get the answer is that if you're using a lot of reserves that you're predetermined you're going to use, it's going to look as if you've got a big deficit. So perhaps it's not as bad as you think. But the reporting I'm looking for is, income, expenditure, profit, loss. These are things I understand, and the weaving in and out of reserves I'm learning to cope with. There was a reserve called the, it's only 1.5 million, but it's called the Strategic Plan Delivery Reserve. And I wanted to ask what the thinking there is. And you seem to be building it up, which is, what's it for? 1520, Strategic Plan Delivery Reserve.
Strategic Plan Delivery Reserve. What page is that on? Right.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. It's funded from savings on, there was a VAT refund, and so I can explain the source. My predecessors determined its purpose and it's unspent. That's all the information I have.
Nabbed a VAT refund, and instead of crediting it, we put it away wisely. We stored it away in a strategic plan delivery reserve. Good point.
I think that's saying that we didn't spend it. We haven't spent it, is it?
Yeah, but it's not in as an expenditure, it's in as a reserves contribution in the budget.
Sorry, I'll have to take that back to my, that was said before I worked it, but I'll take that back. But
it's a very petty point. Please don't spend too much time on it.
No,
it's
that's okay.
It's a small
there
point.
is a simple answer, and I'm embarrassed that I forget what it is actually.
Okay.
But it is very simple. I will report back in the morning on the answer.
There are more important things in the kingdom, so let's not get too diverted. The last point is that when we report the HRA figures, the most interesting figure there is again its equivalent of profit, which I think is called the RCCO, and that I assume is lurking in your finance costs on page 240. Yes. How much is it? Do you know offhand? If not, it'll emerge in due course.
Chris, just mic, please.
Apologies.
Thank you. That's fine.
Table 9.2.
Thanks.
Okay, so I detected a little bit of a hair shirt being worn by Councillor Sunnox at the start of that, but an indication that, you know, the way some of this is presented doesn't always fit with what you see as P&Ls, but
it's really improving though.
Yeah.
So I do want to say
I
thank
agree.
you to Chris and Andrew for that.
Yeah. I think, and I agree with you, Councillor Sunnox. So I think we've dealt with the questions that you had here this evening. Councillor Dundas?
Yeah, just ever so briefly on the strategic plan delivery reserve, I think the explanation is that it is the VAT refund or money back, but in the budget in February 23, it was originally planned to be put into a reserve, not spent, put into a strategic plan delivery reserve, and it looks like we spent it instead. We put it towards the general fund budget, I think. That's what it says anyway. So, but the point still stands. Councillor Sunnox is correct that the net use of reserves, once you take it all out of the wash, the plan was to use 2.23 million reserves. We've used 6.039. That's the bottom line figure, be they earmarked or whatever.
All right. And I think in terms of the 550, Mr. Hartgrove's already indicated that he'll just go away and double check that and indicate to us all what the precise reasoning is. Yeah, I know. I've read that as well, but
I mean, I've no doubt it is the VAT. I agree that. I mean, I wrote it myself, but there's more than one VAT item. There are other figures. not the same figures being different, but there are other VAT figures out there, and I just wanted to confirm precisely what the interpretation of 550, that's all.
Yeah. And I think that makes most sense, doesn't it? So that we're 100% accurate rather than thinking that we know what that actually means. Right. I don't see any other hands or any other indications. So we've been asked to consider and note the revenue position at the end of Q3, the general fund capital position at the end of Q3, and the housing revenue account position at the end of Q3, and the housing revenue account capital position at the end of Q3. I think we've noted all of those things and considered them. All right, thank you. So that's item 12. I was just checking to see Andrew didn't have anything else to add, but I can't see his hand up, so we're all right. Moves us on to item 13 then, the work programme. And all we have left is the one item which we will send you away to beaver away on, Mr. Evans, and find a suitable slot for us to come back and look at the 21-22 accounts only, draft accounts, I should add. The one thing I was going to add to this as well, and I know that Andrew Small has already spoken briefly this evening about the situation regarding audit. I am invited regularly to chairs of audit committees meetings, and there is one of those next Wednesday, if I remember rightly from my calendar. So I will feed back anything that comes from that meeting to the committee members if there's anything that gives rise for clarification about where we're at in the approach to September.
Could you feed into that meeting, Chair, the idea that needs to be a resolution mechanism, not just a deadline, a way of dealing with those councils and auditors who can't meet it, which is slightly painful, but not miserably painful. We need an incentive to get this sorted out. It's so bad that we're 4 years now without an audit.
I take your point, and I think, most, if not all of us around the table and also around the council who take an interest in audit have been concerned about where we're at with audited accounts for more than a year, let's just say.
But there's your opportunity to feed it in and get some weight behind it.
I will feed that back, and as Councillor Small, as Andrew Small has already indicated to us this evening, there are potentially 3 ways forward with regards to our ancient accounts, if I can put it that way now. Councillor King, are you indicating at this stage that you just want to say something?
Well, thank you, Chair. I just want to thank everybody for their time. I'm not going to take any more of it. Well, I clearly am, but only a minute or so. I just want to put on the record, and I hope this would be shared by the committee. You're not quite at the end of your long run through this year, but it has been a huge challenge for many people, including our officers, including Chris and Andrew in particular, who have had the joy of us and Epping all in much the same timetable. Now, we've had a sidebar conversation, and it's something for the committee perhaps, and when we're clear on this, it depends on the next municipal year, about whether we can have a different cycle when it comes to budget examination and review, perhaps, as I know Epping do, to have the substantive conversations earlier, so that we don't have that run that's so late in the day that it's sort of everybody, including opposition members who may want to have again next year a very strong view and have it heard. So I just want to sort of mention that, but I want to ask you one more meeting in your cycle, that as an observer, it's very difficult for officers to respond at the moment to sometimes very complex questions, certainly ones which require some research. So I could just ask, and it's down to your individual time and availability, if we couldn't gather some working days before the meeting, at least those thoughts which are in your mind, as you've already, I'm sure, have some of them already, so that we have a more productive meeting. That's just me looking at this, but it's my duty to give you good counsel. It's your choice as you take it or not, but I do want to try and look after hard-pressed officers here who I know are valued by you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor King. And I was going to make a similar point, and I know I did before this meeting, and I know that Councillor Sunnox had sent something in. Unfortunately, that email, for whatever reason, seems to have gone awry or astray, because neither Mr. Evans nor I could find it, and I'm not quite sure, William, where you sent it from.
It's the wretched spam filter at work again.
I think the answer I would, if I could just prevail upon you, is to use your councillor email when you're sending them in, because that seems to get through. Because I trawled through, I know I've got 2 emails for you, and I trawled through both of those looking for anything, and I couldn't find. So I'm not sure where it went to. And I know a conversation with Matt, he wasn't able to find it either. So if I could just prevail on anyone who is sending in pre-questions, and I think Councillor King makes a very valid point. It's a lot easier, especially when we're looking at this detail, because it's obvious Chris knows the answer to that question about the strategic plan delivery reserve, but he wants to be 100% certain, and the only way he can be 100% certain, especially when we're looking at so many figures, is to have some pre-notification of what some of that detail might be, so that I know there's always likely to be a question that arises because of a question, but when we are looking at the detail that we're looking at, if you can pre-notify our officers, it just makes it that bit easier for all of us. Councillor Dundas.
Just very briefly, I think on the council email system there is like a pre-configured sent to all committee members email, isn't there?
Yeah, I think you're right, Councillor Dundas. So that's probably the easiest thing to use, and that should get through every time, just about every time.
Thanks, Chair. If it's helpful, if you're sending in questions or emails that are important and you don't get an immediate response, can I just say, please, by all means, give me a ring and just say, do you have it? And I'll happily check after a day or so to allow for potential filtering. But if that's helpful, that's, I think that might be a useful thing to do.
Thank you for that, Mr. Evans. Right. With that, I declare the meeting closed. Thank you everyone for your contributions this evening, and those of you online as well.